Quick programming note. This episode was recorded the day before James Comey was indicted, when it was only rumored that the Justice Department was targeting him. Now that the indictment is official, this conversation about the future of our justice system is even more relevant. On another note, I wanted to share a new opportunity for you, the listener, to pull up a seat at our table. If you got something weighing on you, a question you wish someone in politics would really answer, send it to us. Record a voice memo or drop us an email at producer@aotpodcast.com. That's producer@aotpodcast.com. We might feature your question in a future episode of At Our Table. Now, my interview with former Attorney General Eric Holder.
When you become Attorney General, there's a distance that you have to put between yourself and the president that you serve. The Justice Department has an awesome amount of power to incarcerate people, to take property away from people, to bring cases that kind of have impacts on people's lives. And those determinations have to be made on the facts and on the law and without any kind of political consideration. And that's what I'm afraid of that's happening now. This is a Justice Department that thinks of itself as the lawyers for the president, as opposed to the way it's supposed to be, is that you're the lawyers for the people of this country. You're supposed to enforce the Constitution, enforce the laws, the statutes, and not take into those considerations any kind of political determinations. And when that line gets blurred, that is a problematic thing for our nation and for our democracy.
Welcome to At Our Table. I'm your host, Jamie Harrison. Today, I'm joined by my good friend, Attorney General under President Obama, and now the chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, Eric Holder. I first met AG Holder when I was still finding my own path in public service. Watching him lead taught me that protecting democracy isn't just about the laws in the books. It's about the courage to enforce them fairly for everyone. As Attorney General, he led with courage and conviction, protecting voting rights, challenging racial profiling, standing up for marriage equality, and rethinking how our justice system deals with drug crimes. His leadership left a mark on every corner of American life, and so much more. But today, that form of steady, principled leadership at the Justice Department can feel like something from another galaxy. It seems like every day brings another shocking headline about abuse of power or the erosion of trust at the very institution meant to uphold the rule of law. So I thought, my friends, it was high time to bring AG Holder to the table to hear his perspective, not just on what's gone wrong, but on what we can do to protect the rule of law and to strengthen our democracy for the future. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Attorney General Eric Holder.
All right.
How are you, my friend?
Well, I'm doing fine. It's good to see you, Jamie. The way your introduction, you made me sound like I'm about 95 years old, and I met you when I was about 30 years ago or something. You're a good-looking young man, and I'm an older guy, but I'm not as old as some of your listeners might think based on that introduction, okay?
Y'all, he's not old. He's not old. Trust me, he's not old.
I'm young at heart, man. I'm young at heart.
Yeah. Well, Mr. General, it is always good to see you. It is always good to spend some time with you. And right now, we so desperately need your perspective on what's going on with this really messed up world that we're in right now. But before we get to that, I think there are a lot of people who don't know your background. They know that you worked for President Obama, right? They know that you were the Attorney General. But I don't know if folks know that you were a judge, you were the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia under President Clinton, and then eventually you became the Attorney General. But what brought you to this work? Why did you want to do any of that stuff? And give us a sense of what your path was to get there.
Well, one thing I'd add in terms of that employment history, something tends to surprise people, and I think was galling to Republicans. I was one of Ronald Reagan's last judicial picks. I served on the D.C. Superior Court, and I was appointed by Ronald Reagan, something I would always try to sneak into any kind of congressional hearing when they were going at me for something or other. But, I'm a kid who's born of immigrant parents from the Pearl of the Caribbean, Barbados. My father did not finish high school and yet is one of the wisest people I've ever known. I went to the New York City public schools. Went to Columbia College, Columbia Law School. I'm a born and raised New Yorker, and thought I was going to always be in New York until I got to DC after law school. Thought I was going to stay here for about 2-3 years, and I've been here ever since. I'm a kid of the '60s. I grew up at a time when the civil rights movement was in full bloom, when African countries, Caribbean countries were gaining their independence. President Kennedy really inspired me to think about public service as something that was not only good, but honorable. And I always thought, I want to do something that's going to be, progressive, that's going to help people. And I thought a career in government would be something that would be consistent with those goals. Now, if you had told me while I was in law school, well, when I was in college with a huge afro and, Walt Frazier sideburns and all that stuff, that I was going to be a federal prosecutor, I would have thought drug test time. That's not happening. And yet,
Yeah.
by the time I got out of law school, I thought, well, if you want to have the ability to change the system, I think you can do it best by working from inside, as opposed to a defense attorney, honorable and great lawyers, but they have to react to that which prosecutors put in motion. And I thought, well, I want to be on that side and decide which cases get brought, what sentences are sought. And that's what took me from this kind of '60s rabble rouser to federal prosecutor.
Well, was there a stigma then, as there is
Yeah.
now?
Yep.
I think, Kamala Harris would even say it, for a black prosecutor,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Did you deal with any of those headwinds, or got any friction from friends or
Yeah.
folks back in the community?
That's a good observation. Yeah. As I was leaving law school and people were talking about where they were going, and I said, well, I'm going to the Justice Department. I'm going to be working in this thing called the Public Integrity Section. And people would kind of give you the side eye. And people who were closer to me, would say, what the hell are you doing that for, man? I mean, you're going to be, working for the man. And what I explained to them was, look, I'm going to be the man. And that was, I thought, a good way to use the power that I thought I could have as a young lawyer. So yeah, no, there was a stigma attached to it. I watched Kamala get attacked for that. And boy, I kept, I was screaming into the screen, like, own it. Yeah, I was a prosecutor. And you know what I did? I protected people, to make sure that people were safe and secure. I was at the Public Integrity Section, and I tried to make sure that the system worked right and that public officials were held accountable. So there's no reason to try to explain or to apologize. I embrace, what it is that I did. And as I think that Kamala is equally proud.
One of the things I think we should encourage more people from communities of color to go to justice, to participate as a prosecutor, to go there because of the perspective that you bring, right? When we are not there, then, the experiences that we have in our community then aren't reflected in terms of those who are executing the laws and prosecuting injustice, right? So
Yeah.
what's your thought, when you talk to young lawyers who are thinking about which path they should go down?
Yeah, I think that point is an excellent one. And you know what? You know what you're talking about there? The value of, can we say this? Diversity.
Yes.
When I was the United States Attorney here in Washington, D.C., I had left the bench as a Reagan appointee again, left the bench to become the U.S. Attorney. And as a judge, one of the things that I observed was that the U.S. Attorney's Office was filled with, really good people, largely white, largely from like 3 or 4 schools. And these people were good lawyers, but they weren't necessarily the best trial lawyers. And so what I determined when I became U.S. Attorney was to cast a wider net, both in terms of gender, race, the places where people went to law school, to get good trial lawyers. And when you have people who have varied experiences, varied life experiences, varied perspectives, that's how you get to the best decisions. And it's something that I used when I was in every position that I've had in government. I mean, when I was Attorney General, I had an extremely diverse staff. So as we're wrestling with, whatever decisions that we had to confront, from national security to, domestic criminal law, hearing different people, different perspectives, and then trying to give people an ability to share those experiences and let that inform the recommendations that they made. I think that's how you get to the best results. And so this attack, DEI has become, almost like the bad word. And I think we need to start pushing back on that in ways that we have not.
Yeah.
The strength of this nation is its diversity. We're not as homogenous
Amen.
as Japan and other countries. And this country gets revitalized by immigrants like my parents. And the diversity that then engenders is what makes this country exceptional.
One of the things I want to do is spend a little time on your time at Justice Department. But before how did you become Barack Obama's pick for Attorney General? What's the backstory? I've never read about that. So you were a prosecutor, you were a judge. So what was it because you were friendly with Barack Obama? Like, what's the backstory behind how you became Attorney General of the United States?
It was just my excellence, brother. That just propelled me into the position. No. More seriously, it was interesting. I met him at a dinner thrown by a friend of mine, and this is after he had been elected to the Senate, but before he'd actually been sworn in. And she said, "Well, he needs to meet some of the movers and shakers in Washington D.C." Okay, whatever. And so I was at this dinner, and I was sitting next to him, and I thought that was just serendipitous. I talked to Anne Walker Marchant, who was the person who actually put the dinner together. And she said, "No, that was not serendipitous. I put you next to him." Anyway, so we start talking at this dinner. He's from Chicago. I'm from New York. He starts talking about Michael Jordan's the best basketball player of all time. I say it's Kareem
Oh
Abdul-Jabbar.
boy.
Talk about Dr. J. So we have that battle. But then we also start talking about the things I had done as Deputy Attorney General and the things he had done in the state legislature around criminal justice reform. And we just kind of hit it off. And then I would go to his office
Yeah.
every now and again. And then when he made the decision to run for president, he asked me if I'd support him. I said yes, helped him in the campaign, ran the vice presidential search. And then as he was elected, I got an offer to serve in two positions, either as White House counsel or as attorney general. And I thought that I could help him most by being AG. So that offer, I think, was a function of the relationship that we built up over the course of a few years and my excellence.
And your excellence, of course. Well, I think I want to get back to the VP selection process, but I want to drill down on the Attorney General a little bit. I think there are a lot of people who don't know what the hell the Attorney General is supposed to do, particularly if you're just turning on the politics now and you see Pam Bondi, and that is the first time you get a glimpse of an Attorney General. Can you give us a sense of what is the Attorney General supposed to do? Is the Attorney General the president's lawyer? Give us a sense of the way that the role is constitutionally structured or based on the law. It should be structured. And then what's going on today at Justice?
Well, let's put it like this, Ari. I'll talk about what an attorney general is supposed to do, but for people who are just tuning in and looking at the Justice Department now and this attorney general, let me say that's not the way the Justice Department is supposed to operate, full stop. The attorney general is a member of the president's cabinet, and obviously, as I was, a political supporter of the president. But when you become attorney general, there's a distance that you have to put between yourself and the president that you serve. The Justice Department has an awesome amount of power to incarcerate people, to take property away from people, to bring cases that kind of have impacts on people's lives. And those determinations have to be made on the facts and on the law and without any kind of political consideration. When I was going through my confirmation process, I remember Senator Leahy, Patrick Leahy, was the head of the Judiciary Committee, and I remember him telling me, "You're different from other cabinet members. You're not the Secretary of Justice. You're the Attorney General of the United States, and so you're different from your counterparts." And the Justice Department and attorneys general who forget that there has to be that distance, there has to be that independence, are the ones that tend to get in trouble and I think are not favorably looked upon by history. And that's what I'm afraid of that's happening now. This is a Justice Department that thinks of itself as the lawyers for the president, as opposed to the way it's supposed to be, is that you're the lawyers for the people of this country. You're supposed to enforce the Constitution, enforce the laws, the statutes, and not take into those considerations any kind of political determinations. And when that line gets blurred, that is a problematic thing for our nation and for our democracy.
The Republicans would push back on us and say, well, Holder and Obama were close. JFK had his brother at Justice. It's the same thing. I mean, what would you say to that?
All right, that's a nice soundbite. You point, what I would say to them, you point to one thing. You point to one thing where I did something that favored my president over the facts over the law, over the duties that I had as an independent attorney general. You can say that top line thing, but when I say, all right, so fill that out and
Hmm.
then point to something, and they can't do it.
Where are the
I mean, I
receipts?
took yeah, exactly. I mean, I took positions that I know were not favorably viewed, in the White House when I made the determination to look back and to look at the enhanced interrogation techniques that were done by the previous administration. I knew that people in the White House didn't want that to be done, but I thought that was something, that I had to do. When I made the determination to not defend the Defense of Marriage Act, I did that independent of the White House and then told the president after the determination had been made. I told him about that at a Super Bowl party at the White House, that I made the determination not to defend DOMA, and wanted to tell him that so that he didn't read about it in the newspapers, later that week when we had to send the notification to Congress. And it was an interesting interaction because he said to me, that's where I wanted you to land, but I didn't think that I could appropriately tell you that was my view. And that's how I interacted with President Obama, making a weighty decision like that. He, constitutional lawyer, great professor, had a view but did not share it with me. That's in stark contrast to the way in which we see this president, President Trump, interacting with his attorney general.
And we saw how President Trump interacts. I mean, many people think he was supposed to have text Pam Bondi, but I think he posted it on Truth Social, that this message about him being unhappy about the lack of prosecutions of folks like Comey and the Attorney General in New York, Tish James. What popped into your head when you saw that message that he posted? And given the light now that message was posted, and a few days later we're hearing that James Comey may be indicted.
Okay. Well, what I'm about to say is the absolute truth. When I saw that post, I think it was clipped to something that I saw on one of the social media platforms. I thought it was AI generated. I mean, I really thought that this couldn't possibly be real. That's the kind of thing that if a president wanted to kind of go around the norms, the traditions that we have, you think would be done, surreptitiously. This is something that's for the whole world to see, which is essentially to say, look, I'm not happy with the fact that certain people have not been investigated, have not been prosecuted. It's kind of, I mean, so that was shocking for me to see. And then to see the dominoes that were put in effect. U.S. attorney resigns or is pushed out in the Eastern District of Virginia. Now I'm hearing that, Jim Comey might be indicted. One of the people who was mentioned in that post that I saw from the president. I wonder what that means then for Senator Schiff, what that means for Attorney General James. These are very strange and different times, and it worries me a great deal. There are a number of things about which I worry with regard to this administration, but it's steadfast refusal to adhere to the norms connected to the rule of law is in some ways, I think, maybe the most dangerous thing that they are doing.
I think many of us aren't surprised that Trump does this. I mean, we all know that he's corrupt. We all know that he has grudges and does not hesitate to utilize presidential power to act on those grudges. I'm almost more concerned that had this been under any other president, Democrat or Republican, that is not Trump, that this would have been a much bigger story, that the press would not have just, I almost feel like they have just waved it off. Oh, well, it's Trump being Trump. But can you just give us a sense of the scale of what this would have meant had Barack Obama sent you that, posted a message on Twitter to you directed at that, or even under George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan, what that would have meant in terms of the public's focus on that particular
No,
action?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, if this had been Ronald Reagan talking to Ed Meese or George W. Bush talking to Al Gonzalez, President Obama talking to me, there would have been two places where I would have expect to see nuclear detonations. One, the media would have covered this in a way, in an appropriate way, which is to say, what the hell is going on here? I mean, what's this president doing with this attorney general, calling on the attorney general to push back or to resign? That's one place that I would expect to see a really significant reaction. But also, a congressional one, to see Congress react and say, well, wait a minute, we need to have hearings, we need to subpoena people and find out what this is all about. Instead, we have seen, I think, a media that has been, with exceptions, but I think a media that has been a little too accepting of that which is totally abnormal, and a Congress that has simply been supine. Whatever he wants to do, he gets to do, and then they come up with a rationalization for why they're not going to be probing into that which is clearly abnormal and clearly dangerous for for the nation.
What do you think of Pam Bondi as Attorney General?
She clearly, I thought, was going to be better than the initial nominee, Matt
Oh,
Gaetz.
God.
But I got to say, I think that she's been pretty disappointing, kind of a cheerleader for the president in ways that attorneys general do not. It's a tightrope that you've got to walk as attorney general. You want to be supportive of your
Yeah.
president, but to be at the White House as often as she is, announcing things from the White House, and then kind of being on Fox in the way that she is, and not taking positions that it seems to me are independent of that which the White House wants to do, and then not standing up for your people. I mean, as they are in the process of firing career prosecutors, as U.S. attorneys are forced out, assistant U.S. attorneys are forced out, as people at the FBI are forced out. You can't just let that happen for the organizations that you're supposed to lead. And if a determination that you make is that they're asking you to do things that are inconsistent with the obligations that you have, the duties that you have, the responsibilities that you have as Attorney General, you resign. As AG, you have the ability to put up 4 portraits of your predecessors in the big conference room that's on the 5th floor. And I had 4 people, and one of them was Elliot Richardson. And he was there to remind me that my job as Attorney General was to represent the people of the United States. And that if somebody asked me to do something inconsistent with that, I had to oppose that. And if I could not successfully oppose it and there was pressure brought to bear on me, you resign. It's a great job to have, but it's more important that you do the job in a way that is consistent with the Constitution and our norms.
I just think the damage that is being done, not only to justice, but I across the spectrum, the State Department that this administration's done, the institutional knowledge and memory that is just being decimated with cuts that are coming that aren't even thoughtful cuts, but just trying to gut the system and gut any pushback that they will get. I mean, it's going to take generations for us to heal the damage that's just been, it's not even a damn year yet. This guy's been in the White House, but I think it'll be generations just to rebuild the status of many of these agencies. And I think justice is definitely one of those.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that we don't have that kind of time. We can't wait generations to get these institutions back to some semblance of normal. And I think it's incumbent upon us to be thinking now about what is, let's assume that, fingers crossed, that there is a Democratic president who gets elected in 2028. When you start in January of 2029, what does this new administration have to do? Not only to rebuild, but to kind of maybe reimagine some of these institutions. Obviously, the Justice Department is near and dear to my heart. It's a place I have a lot of experience, and I have some ideas about ways in which we can maybe make that period of reconstruction, that period of rebuilding, shorter than it otherwise might be. But it's going to require planning. Now, you can't wait until the election and think that you can do this over the course of the period between the election and the inauguration. That's not enough time. You got to start thinking about that even now.
Where do you think that planning needs to? Who needs to own that right now? Is that something that you think? The DNC is a political organization and not, it's less policy oriented. Because I think you're right. We need our best and our brightest minds to really come up with a framework for when we get another Democratic administration, and from your mouth to God's ears that happens, but to really figure out and have a plan together to rebuild these institutions that have just are going to be destroyed or close to being destroyed under this administration. Where do you think that should be housed right now? Because I think that's a wonderful idea. I just don't know who should own it.
Let me say this, and I don't want to reveal too much here. Let's just say that there are conversations and groups of people who are already about that business, and so there will be plans. When you're attorney general, you get a book, and I'm sure other cabinet members get the same thing, a big book that teams who come in during the transition period with analyses of what's going on, and talked about various components within the Justice Department with proposals and all that. And so I think books like that, ideas like that will be put together, but will be done well before transition. That kind of work is already underway. But the deal is, this battle's got to be fought on two fronts. I mean, I think, yeah, we got to prepare for the possibility, and I think really the really good possibility that you'll have a Democratic president in January of 2029, while at the same time fighting the here and now and dealing with trying to minimize the amount of destruction that this administration is going to do. And I think you're very right to say not only at the Justice Department, but in other places as well. What they've done with the hollowing out of these various agencies has a negative impact on the ability of these agencies to do the day-to-day stuff. But what really worries me, Jamie, is when the really big things happen, when the crises really occur, be they foreign or domestic, and you don't have the institutional knowledge to respond in an appropriate way, in a quick way, we could end up with some really bad decision making that will hurt us in the short term and also do harm to our long-term interests.
And particularly when you have the JV team that's in the leadership, they love to talk about DEI and how diversity hires as if folks of diverse backgrounds are less than. But man, I don't think I've seen an administration, Democrat or Republican, that has more scrubs leading agencies and important organizations than this one does. I mean, these people, I wouldn't hire them to clean the gutters right now because they're just that bad.
Well, the DEI, as I said, has gotten a bad rap. And one thing I think that people need to understand, there's not a tension between diversity, equity, and inclusion and excellence. There's not a tension. You can focus on diversity and still have really, really good people. Now, these folks are deciding that they don't want to focus on DEI, but they're not focusing on excellence either.
No.
These are folks who were podcasters, firebrands, who've never run anything in their lives. And now that they're the heads of these institutions, they're not doing, great jobs. You look at Kash Patel at the FBI. He's talking about got to release these Epstein files, got to do all these great things, get to be the head of the FBI. Well, you've got the capacity, the power to release the Epstein files. And what do? You don't do it.
You don't do it.
So, it's a jujitsu. And so they're not doing it because I suspect they're concerned about what the political fallout will be for the president that they serve. And they're taking positions totally inconsistent with where they were when they weren't in government.
I want to transition a little bit and go back to something you mentioned earlier in terms of some things that you have done in terms of your career. And for both Barack Obama and just recently for Kamala Harris, you oversaw the VP selection process. So you've done a process in which you have plenty of time, under Barack Obama to find a VP. The VP was Joe Biden that was selected. And then under Kamala Harris, you had 2 weeks. My apologies for that. Can you take us back behind the curtain? What happens in a VP selection process?
First off, you need more time than we had with regard to the pick for Vice President Harris. Though I think, Tim Walz, I think was a great pick in any case. So, it's an unbelievably invasive process. And, we ended up using a whole bunch of lawyers from my law firm with regard to this process, the one for Vice President Harris. And we decided to keep it in one firm so that we could have, all the lawyers there communicating with one another. We had separate teams. Each team had probably like 5 or 6 lawyers. We started out with maybe 70 lawyers or so, something like that. And as a candidate the decision was made not to go further with that candidate, the lawyers from that team would then be moved to another team. But it's an extremely invasive process where you're looking at every public statement that person has made, every public statement that the family of that person has made, the policy positions that they have taken. You want to peek and see are there any potential scandals in their lives. you go through all the stuff where the lawyers are talking to them, and then I tend to have, a one-on-one conversation with the candidate to ask the really, kind of private questions, and you really find out a lot about people, and then you got to write it up as best you can and present it to either Barack Obama or Kamala Harris so that they can, make their determinations, and then they interact with maybe the last 3 or 4 people who they think they want to consider, and then they ultimately, make a determination. It was an unbelievable experience in both ways, but really, really unbelievable with regard to the process that we had to do for Kamala Harris. That was, I've not read 107 Days, her book, but I'm interested to see what, if anything, she says about the vice presidential selection process.
Well, the one thing that did make headlines, and I don't know if you heard this, is that she revealed that her initial preference was for Pete Buttigieg, Secretary of Transportation at the time. But partly in the book, she says that she just thought it might have been too much. Given 107 days, too much for a black woman married to a Jewish man and then VP, a gay man. That almost too much for the country to absorb. And I don't know if you have any thoughts as it relates to that. The one thing that I think that you and I both are pragmatic. We wish for the best and hope for the best in terms of this country, but we also understand we are still striving to get to those ideals of this nation, and we're not there yet. But what's your thought on that?
Well, it's interesting. I've seen her on TV say that Secretary Buttigieg was her first choice. I deliberately made, the decision to say, not ask her where she was going so that we wouldn't be influenced by that. We came up with a list of, I think, maybe 10, 12 people without any sense of where, she wanted to go. I'm not revealing anything by saying that, Secretary Buttigieg was one of the people who we vetted. But so I didn't know. I didn't know that. So when I read that, it was like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. But I can see how she would make that, that political calculation that, you're asking the nation to elect the first woman, the first African American woman, first South Asian woman, 107 days to introduce yourself to the nation, and to say, well, that as at least as part of that calculation, the determination that having Secretary Buttigieg on the ticket might have been difficult for the American people. I mean, I can see that school of thought. On the other hand, it could have been seen as, an unbelievably bold move that showed, real courage on her part. And, both people, both sides, I think, can be argued. And that's why she was the one who made the big decisions. And I was there just to kind of give her as much information as she could use.
Sometimes the person that is leading that process, I think back to Dick Cheney, ends up being in the process. Have you ever thought about maybe being VP or even president?
Well, I toyed with the idea of running for president, I guess, back in 2020. And my lovely wife, something I thought was pretty interesting. She said, you'd be great.
Yeah.
And I'd vote for you, but you'd be running as a single man. And I thought, okay, well, that's an interesting way of putting it. She had said later on, she was just kidding, that, if that's the determination I'd made, that she'd have been supportive. My family didn't like the idea when I ran it by them, talked to my 3 kids. They were like, hey, you've served your time, Dad, as AG. So I toyed with the idea, but I did not try to fool around with the process when it came to Kamala, to try to say, well, actually, none of these folks are all that good. You need to think about me. I didn't pull a Dick Cheney there.
Well, 2028 is coming down the pike. I don't think I've seen you on the schedule yet to come here to South Carolina, but we'd love to have you if you're thinking about it.
I think I'm a little old now.
Oh.
That I think my shot was in 2020. It's interesting. I talked to Harry Reid about that. He and I had one-on-one in his office, and he said that he actually encouraged me to do it, and he said something that I thought was interesting. He said, if you don't do it, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. And I look back on that conversation, and every now and again I think, what if? And it might have happened, might not have happened, but at least I would have made the attempt. So I wouldn't say I regret that for like the rest of my life, but it is something that I think about every now and again.
Well, I want to be on the record and think you would have been a damn good president. So
Well, there you go. And I could come live at your house.
Yes, pretty much. My wife would probably kick both of us out.
But they give you a place to live when you're president. So I guess that I still
Yeah.
I'd have been in a nice house by myself. That's what it is. Yeah.
Well, I mean, given that you've been so close to presidential politics, really in some of the biggest races that we've seen these last few years, what do you think we need in a nominee in 2028?
I,
What type of characteristics?
yeah. I think we need somebody who is unapologetically proud to be a Democrat. And by
Mm,
that, I mean, you know, you take to the public, to the voting public, that which has defined our party at its best. Understand our history. This is the party of Roosevelt, of Truman, of Kennedy, of Johnson, of Obama. You know, that's who we are. And to be unafraid to do that, to be unafraid to take on the interests that I think have gotten too much power, too much sway in our nation now, oligarchs, big corporations. And that's not, people tend to think, oh, that's the kind of the progressives and it's the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, the AOC wing of the party. And I would say that, that vein of the party is totally consistent with, go back to the New Deal, where Franklin Roosevelt was taking on moneyed interests in an attempt to forge a social compact between government and the people it's supposed to serve that has really, done well for this country for almost 90 years, at this point. So I kind of get back to some of that old time stuff. And I think if you do that, you will naturally bring back to the party elements of the electorate that we say we've lost touch with, the working class.
yeah.
But I think a fighter, again, somebody who will be, unafraid, unapologetic. One of the things I always say is that Democrats and progressives are squeamish about talking about the acquisition of power and the use of power. And we got to get over that. We need to want to say and demonstrate that we want power and then use power in appropriate ways. Doesn't mean we have to be like Republicans, where they, I think, misuse power. But, think about Lyndon Johnson and what he did. Crafty, smart, politically smart. He wanted power, and then he used the power to transform the nation in fundamentally good ways. Again, same thing with Roosevelt. And so fighters, the stuff about, civility. Yeah, civility is a nice thing. I don't necessarily think that should be, priority one. Healing the nation, bringing us together, I think that's fine. But I think you can bring the nation together and heal some of these rifts by looking out for the vast majority of the people in this country. And that means necessarily breaking some eggs and breaking some relationships that maybe the party has put together over the course of the last couple of decades.
General, I think you were spot on that. One of the things that just continues to keep me up at night, I still have nightmares about, but I know that we damn well, if we ever get to this point, we better utilize it in a better way. It is during that brief period, and you remember this, during the administration where the Obama administration, we had 60 votes in the Senate and we had control of the House and we had the White House. And that we did not have an agenda as a party to just all of the things, the wish list, right, that we want to get done, just have that on the ready, send the bills to the damn House Rules Committee, get it on the floor, and, limited debate and pass the hell out of all of it. And then if we want to go back and tweak it and have the fights in. But just to have a baseline of stuff that we need to get done, that the American people want us to get done when you get that type of opportunity. We, as a party, we are sometimes, we will we negotiate against ourselves instead of just doing the work that needs to be done and to utilize the power that we have. And it's a bit frustrating, but
yeah, I mean, and even more recently, we're dealing with this whole gerrymandering problem now.
oh yes,
It's
and
it's
I
a
wanted to
problem
get there.
that we didn't even have to deal with if we had senators willing to say, you know what, we're going to do a carve out with regard to the filibuster when it comes to democracy related issues. And we had the ability to do that if Senators Manchin and Sinema, for instance, had decided to do that. But for whatever reason, they decided not to do that. And so that plunges us into the place where we are now, where we're in this race to the bottom around partisan gerrymandering. And we had the power. We had the power
We
to
had the
do that
power.
which was necessary. Nancy Pelosi very artfully got the thing through the House. All you had to deal with was the filibuster in the Senate, because you could have gotten 50 votes, for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the other electoral reforms that would have really served this nation well. But again, hesitant to use the power that we had. I mean, Senator Sinema and Manchin, you defended the filibuster over measures that would have improved our democracy. I just don't. I don't see that.
And part of the reason why their argument was so ass backwards was because they said, "Well, we're trying to keep the middle. We're trying to defend, bipartisanship. We're trying to continue to work together and decorum and all those other stuff." Well, the singular thing that I believe is a cancer to our democracies, which is a cancer to why Congress does not operate right now, is political gerrymandering. And what we were saying with this is protect the right to vote and political gerrymandering as we know it. Let's set up these bipartisan commissions in every state, not just in blue states, but in every state. So we don't have elected officials choosing their voters, but the voters are choosing their elected officials, and bringing that middle, which Sinema and Manchin both claim that they represent, to give them more power and more say over where our government goes. That one thing would have accomplished just that. But they were so into their own importance that they just couldn't see it. Did you have any conversations with any of them during that time?
Oh yeah. Spoke to them unsuccessfully, obviously. I get a little wary when I hear people talking about, well, the aim should be bipartisanship. The aim should be civility. Those are good things. I think we should be civil in our conversations. Yeah, that's fine. And yeah, it's great if we can get people to go along. That's great, bipartisanship. But at the end of the day, you're elected to protect and advance the interests of the people. And the question is, how do you do that? And, if in a gerrymandered system, you are secure in the fact that you will win a general election. The only thing you have to worry about is being challenged in a primary. And so that pushes people on the Republican side further and further to the right, and be fair, maybe drives people on the Democratic Party maybe further and further to the left. So you're worried about, you want to do all that you can to make sure that you don't invite a challenger, which means you don't reach across the aisle. Because that's seen as a sign of weakness, and that invites a challenger. Don't reach across the aisle, and therefore things don't get done. Congress is seen as ineffective because it doesn't pass any legislation. That raises cynicism in the American people about the ability of our government to function. So it is like your word is not too strong. It is a cancer in the body politic of this nation. And we had the ability, we had the power as late as just a couple of years ago to outlaw, partisan gerrymandering, and we didn't do it.
You have been chairing probably now almost a decade, this National Democratic Redistricting Committee that we have that has really been trying to establish these nonpartisan commissions and really end political gerrymandering as we know it across the country. But given the Donald Trump attempts, starting in Texas, and now we're starting to see in other states, Missouri, I'm hearing, in Indiana, even some rumors here in South Carolina.
Yeah.
You've decided to kind of change direction a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've been the head of the NDRC since 2017, and our fight has been for fairness. The way in which we've come to think of this is that if the system is fair, Democrats, progressives will do just fine. Let's have, as you said, let's have the people decide who they want to have represent them, as opposed to having politicians choosing who their voters ought to be. And so we have fought for fairness through independent commissions, by supporting candidates who will stand for fairness, a whole variety of things that we have tried to do, reform measures that we put in place, trying to raise people's consciousness about the dangers of gerrymandering. And yet, when Donald Trump calls Greg Abbott and says, I need 5 more seats out of Texas. I mean, it's like when he called Raffensperger, in Georgia and said, I need 11,780 votes. Well, I don't agree with Raffensperger on a whole bunch of stuff, but he had the guts to tell the president, no, we're not going to do that. Greg Abbott, by contrast, said 5, no problem, we're on it. And they changed their system, have now put in place a gerrymander, which is on top of a gerrymander that already existed, both of which have racial implications because it discriminates against Hispanics and Blacks in Texas. And so when you see that, even with my commitment to fairness, I can't be blind to the political reality that it is that we face. And what I said was, we have to save our democracy now so that we can ultimately heal it. I can't let them destroy our democracy with what they're doing now and think that I can try to put together something that has been destroyed if I do take measures or support measures that I said were responsive, that were responsible, and that were temporary and got us through this crisis, and then get back to the fight for fairness, that made a great deal of sense. And I think what California is doing in response to what Texas has done makes a great deal of sense. 5 seats there, all right, well, 5 seats in California. The difference is in California, that has to be approved by the people, as opposed to having it rammed down their throats as it was in Texas, where politicians in Texas just rammed their power grab down the throats of people in Texas who clearly did not want that to happen. Thousands of people testified against what they were trying to do in Texas. Newspapers editorialized against it, but they, wanted to follow that which the president told them to do.
What other states are you tracking right now that you are concerned with that may be going down this path? I know California is going to respond to what Texas has done. I mean, you take a look at it, I don't know if Democrats, in the end of the day, have enough states where they can respond in kind to an Indiana, Missouri, or whatever. But what are the states that you are really concerned about as we take a look at this new MAGA gerrymandering effort that's taking place?
Well, Missouri, obviously, that's already been passed by their legislature, just waiting for the signature of the governor. Indiana to see what they do. Kansas is talking about, doing something there. South Carolina, as you mentioned, potentially Florida as well. I think Florida, you will see potentially something happen at the beginning of next year. And there are, statutory, constitutional arguments that can be made against everything that they are proposing to do. And we'll be fighting them every place that we can with regard to lawsuits that we will bring. I mean, we have lawsuits already in Texas. We'll be, as soon as the governor signs the bill in Missouri, we'll be ready to go with a lawsuit there. Same thing in Indiana. Any place that they try to do these kinds of things, we will oppose them in court or any other way that we possibly can to try to get people in those states to raise their voices against that which they are trying to do, in the hope that there is a political consequence that they pay for these attacks on our democracy. Because I think that's what people need to understand. This isn't just about gerrymandering, because that's kind of a granular thing, and it's serious. That's very serious.
Mm-hmm.
What this ultimately is, this is an attack on our democracy. This is an attack on the ability of the people to choose their leaders, to choose the policy directions of this country. And that's why we have to fight.
And just in case people, folks who have listened to us now for 5 or 6 minutes talk about this, and these guys keep talking about gerrymandering. What the hell is gerrymandering? I mean, can you just succinctly tell folks what is gerrymandering and why it's so bad?
Yeah, well, gerrymandering is the drawing of lines for congressional districts or for state legislative districts drawn in such a way that you maximize the chances that one party is going to win and minimize the possibility that another could possibly win. And you do it really by packing, a whole bunch of people from the other party maybe into one district so that the other 4 districts in a state can be won by your party, or you crack the voters in your state so that you disperse people in a variety of places to minimize the power that they have as voters. It's a pretty insidious thing. We've seen gerrymandering in this country for almost as long as we have been a nation, but it doesn't mean that we need to accept it just because it's been there all the time. And, to be fair, if you look at history, Democrats have done it as well as Republicans, but since 2011 or so, Republicans have really focused on gerrymandering as a way to hold on to power that they cannot earn in fair elections when they put their programs, when they put their candidates before the American people. And that's what led to the formation of the NDRC in 2017, is what has guided our work since that time. We're looking for fairness. I've taken on Democrats who have tried to gerrymander. When the Supreme Court case was considered about partisan gerrymandering, the Rucho case, I was on the side of the people who were standing against Democrats in Maryland. Now, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, said, federal courts can't get involved in partisan gerrymandering. And so the Supreme Court bears a substantial responsibility for the place where we are right now in this gerrymandering fight.
We often talk about the court cases that you all are pushing forward. And, for many of us, we look at the courts as the last line of defense in terms of protecting our democracy. But I would even argue that these attacks on our democracy probably even started in the courts, particularly the Supreme Court. Recently, I wrote a Substack article about how our current Supreme Court, led by John Roberts, is in its Dred Scott era. And by that, I meant that it's like the Taney Court in the Dred Scott decision, which wrote that, that wrote Black Americans out of the Constitution, right? But when we take a look at it, the reason why we are having these debates about states like Texas and South Carolina redrawing in such a way and being able to do this is because this Roberts Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Can you just, for our listeners and viewers, just give a little summary of what I'm talking about that? What was the Voting Rights Act? Why it was so important? And what did Roberts and his court do in order to really spark this wildfire that we're seeing now in terms of these crazy gerrymandering cases?
Well, I'll certainly focus on, what they did with regard to the Voting Rights Act, but I think you have to look at, kind of pull back and see what the Roberts Court has done with regard to our democracy. Everything from Citizens United when it comes to the financing of our campaigns, the Shelby County case that gutted substantial portions of the Voting Rights Act, the Rucho decision essentially said that, partisan gerrymandering is not something that you can bring in federal courts, and other cases that have been, from my perspective, anti-democracy decisions by a very divided, conservative-led Supreme Court. 5-4 decisions, now 6-3 decisions, the totality of which make the Roberts Court look very bad as history tries to assess his tenure as Chief Justice. The Shelby County case, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, was a really, really bad decision. A lot of the things that we're dealing with now would not have occurred had that decision not been made by, again, a 5-4 Supreme Court. The Voting Rights Act provisions that they took out allowed for pre-clearance by the Justice Department in those states that were covered by the Voting Rights Act. And so if you wanted to change something with regard to polling locations, you wanted to change lines with regard to potential racial gerrymandering, all that had to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department. And the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. could say to those covered jurisdictions, no, we're not going to let you do that. They then have to go before a court in Washington, D.C., and a judge makes the determination about who actually wins. But the prophylactic effect of the Voting Rights Act meant that most states who were covered didn't even try to do those things because they thought they couldn't win challenging the Justice Department, or they didn't want to have the publicity that having the Justice Department sue them for that which they were trying to do. And taking that provision away from the Voting Rights Act has really led to a whole bunch of stuff, that poll closures as a result of that which the Republicans have done in certain areas would have been prevented by a Voting Rights Act that had been left alone. The movement of taking people off the voter rolls, purging voter rolls in certain areas, again, could have been prevented if the Shelby County case had not occurred. And we see the closure of polling places and the purging happen in communities where people are perceived to be Democratic, disproportionately communities of color. All of that would have been stopped had there not been that Shelby County decision.
Do you think in 2028, reform of the Supreme Court should be a part of the platform for the Democratic Party?
Absolutely. I think the Supreme Court has to be reformed, potentially, expanded. We cannot simply allow this court to continue to do that which it has done. They don't focus on precedent. They focus on personnel. And by that, I mean, they think, all right, we've got 6 votes and we can now do things that are inconsistent with precedent, long-term precedents that have been put in place to the detriment of our democracy, to the detriment of fairness, and that means political fairness as well as economic fairness. And so I think, that should be a part of whoever runs for president, Supreme Court reform.
Well, I definitely hope all of those folks who are thinking about 2028 are really thinking about that in a way that Democrats have not normally thought about the court and have been as strategic as Republicans have been about the court and the appointments and the like, because I think it's so key and so necessary. When you lose that final line of defense in terms of the court, seeing the end of democracy as we know it, it becomes much more clear and much more scary.
Well, at a minimum, I think that anybody who runs for president should say that I am for and will try to implement, either by constitutional amendment or if there's a statutory way to do it, term limits
Yes.
for people who serve on the Supreme Court. In my book that I wrote, I said that term limits of 18 years is enough. People shouldn't be on the Supreme Court for 30, 40 years, become disconnected from the country that they're supposed to serve. 18 years is enough for anybody to serve on the Supreme Court. And that has huge support by Republicans, by Democrats, by independents. And so I think at a minimum, that should be a part of any Democratic Party platform.
Wholeheartedly agree with you on that. Well, Mr. General, we present a special award on this show every week, and it's called the Sit Your Ass Down Award. Presented to presented to the person that really just needs to get themselves back together. Right? You get yourself in the corner, get your stuff back together. Maybe you need to just sit your ass down for a second. So our guests get the opportunity to present that award. So this week, Mr. General, the question is, who is your recipient of the At Our Table Sit Your Ass Down Award?
That's interesting. All right. Well, let me give a bifurcated answer here. Good
I got
typical lawyer. I give a Lifetime Achievement Award to Marjorie Taylor Greene, to Nancy Mace, and to Stephen Miller. They get the Lifetime Achievement Award when it comes to sit your ass down and shut up. Okay, that's one. But I think the award for this week goes to Brandon Carr, also known as Tony Soprano. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. The FCC chairman who trying to take on Jimmy Kimmel, but doing a whole bunch of other things as well that are inconsistent with, I think, the responsibilities that he has as FCC chairman. Doesn't care about the First Amendment, is looking for the consolidation of power, allowing the consolidation of media power so that it will serve his conservative views. And I would say, Brandon Carr, you need to sit your ass down.
There you go. This week's recipient of the Sit Your Ass Down Award from Attorney General Eric Holder. General Holder, it is always a pleasure to see you, my friend. Thank you so much for being with us on At Our Table.
All right. Thanks for having me, man.
If you enjoyed today's show, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or anywhere you find your podcasts. To be the first to know who will be at our table next, find us at ourtablepodcast.com. At Our Table with Jamie Harrison is a production of Vision Blue Media. Our founding executive producers are Jason Hayter and Jamie Harrison. Our producers are Kyle Kelly and Emily Harrell. Our content consultants are Ernie Grigg and Clay Middleton. Our digital communications are led by Silly Riccio. Neil Rossini of FWRV LLP provides production legal. Title sequence by Tom Hunt. Our theme song, Blonde Gone, is written by Dewey and published by Alibi Music Library. We recorded this episode at As Told by Studio in Columbia, South Carolina. Special thanks to Attorney General Eric Holder and his team. I'm Jamie Harrison, and I look forward to another conversation at our table.